Hello everyone, welcome once again. Today we're going to be sharpening a Sujihiki in white steel. Going to be demonstrating a few stones, starting out with the Naniwa 150 Omera stone. The stone is made after a natural stone, the natural Omera stone. It's a very muddy type stone that produces a nice natural type edge. It's best suited for larger bevels. It's not as fast cutting as some 150 grit stones, but it's fairly decent and it works great for traditional style knives. So today we're going to start out. I'm going to just demonstrate to you that this knife is really dull. Has some microchips in the edge, some other things. But we're going to make sure it starts out real dull so you get an idea of just how much it's tearing into the paper as it's cutting through. It's really only cutting it because it's thin. As you can see, I went across the stone there to make it nice and dull. I did that just so you can see how quickly you're able to establish, or you can establish an edge on a knife with a stone like this. Especially a thin blade such as the one that's on this Sujihiki. So we're going to go ahead and start out. Only downside to sharpening a knife like this on a stone like this is that the amount of slurry or mud that builds up on this stone tends to scratch above the bevel at this coarse grit. Not something I'm real fond of, but this was a requested sharpening video for the demonstration of different stones, and this was the knife that I was sent to sharpen, so there will be some minor scratching above the bevel in random spots, but it's not too much to really worry about. It's not going to affect the performance of the blade, and you kind of have to really look at it to see it. Like I mentioned, this is more suited for a larger bevel where you're putting more steel in the stone, and the slurry or the mud actually tends to float the blade across, and that's what does the sharpening as you work. In this case, we're really not even using the stone long enough to get it to that point. It's working and it's cutting, but it's not moving on to its full potential. That's pretty good right there. Like I said, it's going to move along pretty quickly with the stone because of the thinness of the blade. Take the little sheet of paper here I first started out with. As you can see, I put a decent slicing edge on there. It's not something I'd want to actually use to cut a lot of things. It is very, very coarse. And need to have a little nick in the blade there. I don't know how that happened. That's all taken care of now. Question always comes up about what angle should I sharpen at. With high-end knives such as these, I've always found the lower the better. I just kind of put my finger on the spine, and that's about the angle you want to hold. Probably around 10 or 15 degrees when it all works out. If you're doing it by hand, you're going to have a natural roll to your edge, which is going to have a variation of probably 3 or 5 degrees per side. Sounds like a lot, but in reality, it's not much. It's something you're not even going to notice. Not only that, it'll help with the cutting performance of the blade, because it'll be smoother on the back bevel and a little more obtuse on the main apex of the cutting edge, which will give you a little bit smoother of a cut, a little stronger of an edge overall. So that was it for the 150 grit. Like I said, it's not the fastest stone, but it did cut quickly for this blade. It's a muddy stone, so you get a little bit of unwanted scratching above the bevel for this type of blade, but it works fairly well for traditional style knives. Now we're going to move on to the 1000 grit Urashiyama stone. This stone is one of my first, actually my first water stone. I had a set of king stones before, I wasn't real fond of them. I gave up on that, and a few years later I did my research and picked up a set of Urashiyama stones. This stone I really like simply for the fact that it cuts a lot of steels quickly. It has some natural-like qualities, and it will produce a nice mud that's kind of fun to work with, which also helps refine your scratch pattern on your edge. This stone, like the 150, you don't want to really add water to them, because if you do, that will detract from the working properties of the stone. It won't work the way it should, and you won't get the edge or the mud buildup that these stones produce that make them work the way they do. So we're going to go ahead and get started with this one. As you can see, it builds a lot of mud up on the surface, and this mud will help effectively reduce the scratch pattern. It also helps it glide across the surface of the stone a little smoother. If you add too much water to this stone and don't let the mud build, the surface of the stone tends to glaze up a lot with metal. That's not something you really want to happen. If you like Aoto stones, you'd like this stone. This stone reminds me a lot of an Aoto stone, but it still cuts at a 1000 grit level. I say it reminds me of an Aoto because of the type of mud it produces and the hazy type of finish it can produce on a larger bevel. And because of the mud production and how it'll reduce its own scratch a little bit, it will make it easier to jump to a higher grit stone. If you have the scratch pattern pretty well refined, it's going to take and work down the burr, do some longer strokes here. Finish up with a few edge trailing strokes. I'll do this on every stone just to make sure the edge is aligned and burr free. Helps us moving on to higher grit stones because your edge is more pure, more ready for the next stone, if you will. That's pretty good for the 1K stone. Go ahead and grab a little piece of paper over here. Not the absolute sharpest, but it's progressing along nicely. Cutting a little smoother than it did. Next stone I'm going to use is the Nanowatt 2K Green Brick of Joy. This stone is well liked by many simply because it is the Green Brick of Joy. It's a joy to use, it cuts a lot of steels quickly, and produces a very high finish for its rated grit. It says 2K, but it can easily reach 4000 grit in my opinion, which makes it a nice prep stone for very high grit stones such as an 8 or a 10K, which also depends on your steel, how hard the steel is, and what type of blade you're dealing with. It's not something you can do for every knife. There is there's a couple ways you can use this stone. I could make a mud formation on the surface, which would help with the cutting action a little bit. But because it does cut so fast, and that is more of a polishing stone in my opinion with the type of level we're working on today, I'm just going to work with it with water on the surface. This is the type of stone where you want to start using more water on the surface. You don't want to let it run dry, or you will have problems associated with letting your stone run dry on a higher grit stone. It's called the Green Brick of Joy because it's very smooth, very pleasurable to work with. Like I mentioned, it cuts very quickly. As you can see, we already got a large amount of metal and swarf built up on the surface. Feedback is slightly, got a slight grit feel to it, like it's cutting into the metal, but it's very smooth. Like I mentioned, this stone polishes to about a 4K level. Does so pretty quickly. I'm actually using a pretty good amount of pressure while I'm sharpening here, and that's just to get things moving along. You want to be mindful of your pressure. You don't want to keep the same amount of pressure through the whole sharpening process. You definitely want to lessen it up as you go. What that does is that reduces the amount of burr formation that you have, because the amount of burr that you form is closely related to the amount of pressure you apply. Now in this case I probably should have started with a little bit of mud on the surface, simply because it would have helped reduce the scratch pattern. Because of how quickly this stone loads, it loaded up before it was done reducing the scratch pattern on the blade. So that's why I cleaned it off right there. And we're kind of starting over. It's not something you typically want to do, because when you start over like that, after the stone has collected all that metal on the surface and it's polishing the edge down, once you start over like I'm doing, you're starting over with your scratch pattern. It's beginning at square one. It takes you back down to that 2K grit, and you have to work back up. You refine that grit pattern by letting the metal swarf build up on the surface. And if you disturb that metal swarf that's built up onto the surface of the stone, then you change the scratch pattern that you're putting onto the blade. Similar applies when you're using a mud on the surface of the stone. If you wash off the mud, you start back with square one. So it's best to just leave things in place and work the blade on the stone until you feel finished with it, or satisfied with the results. edge feels pretty good at this point. I'm going to go ahead and rinse off my stone, get the excess stuff off there. We're going to work to finish this edge up on the stone, some edge trailing strokes, work down that burr, make sure the edge is in good alignment. The edge trailing stroke technique that I'm using, I derived from Murray Carter. I watched some of his videos when I first started to learn how to use water stones. I noticed he started out by leading up to the tip and then following through at the edge. I didn't quite understand what that was doing for the sharpening at first until I tried it myself. And I found that if you started at the tip and tried to work through the bevel, it takes every bit of your angle control to hold that. You got to first find it immediately at that very small point and then hold it perfectly all the way through. And sometimes you just can't do that. Sometimes you'll end up missing it and you'll end up putting a little micro bevel on there. And it's really disheartening when you've worked for 20, 30 an hour on sharpening a blade and all of a sudden you do that to your edge. It's something that can almost drive you nuts. So when I was watching him and I seen him do that, I tried it myself a few times and realized that by doing so you lock the bevel into the stone much easier. You start out with a little bigger surface area and you can feel up to the bevel and get to your tip, and then you can continue on through the bevel, holding a more consistent angle throughout. So it's real simple, but very effective. Feeling for a burr, I just drag it across my nail backwards like so. My finger's real tuned in after years of doing that. I can feel even the most minute burr on the edge. Most of the burr is pretty much gone from that edge, and we are ready to move on to our next stone. Bring our handy dandy piece of paper back here. Oops. As you can see, the edge is very sharp at this point. It's probably good enough for kitchen use. Like I said, the nanowash stone produces a very high grit finish on the edge, and if this was a knife being used a lot in a kitchen, that would be plenty enough to finish on. It produces a high enough finish where not too many people would be unhappy with the cutting performance of that knife. But because this is a little bit of a stone demonstration, we're going to continue on today. We use the Arishiyama 6K stone. It's another one of my well-used finishing stones. I'm going to go ahead and clean the surface off here. It was a synthetic Nagara I used to clean the surface. You don't want to use a synthetic Nagara to build the mud on the surface of a stone, especially in this high of a grit. I'll do it sometimes on my 1K or my 1200 grit Nubatama, because I really like that 1200 grit Nubatama for the finishing of some of my woods hunting knives and such. Produces a real nice edge on more standard type blades. But you don't want to use it so much on a higher stone like this because it's synthetic. It's not the same type of stone material, and it will affect the edge. in a not so good way. You'll put a pretty ugly scratch pattern compared to what the stone can do, and it doesn't leave a very clean apex to your cutting edge. I do want to produce a little bit of a mud slurry on this stone, just to help with its cutting action. I'm going to take my diamond plate, a little Harbor Freight diamond plate. You don't want to go overboard when you're doing this because you're just wasting away your stone. You don't want to do too little where you don't have any mud on the surface. So a few seconds like I did there, produce enough mud to get you working. This 6K Rishiyama, once again, is a very natural-like stone. You can easily build up a mud, which will refine itself and hold the metal slurry that you remove, and it will, in some cases, produce the hazy, natural-type finish, or if used in other ways, it will produce a very high polish finish. Good dual-purpose stone, can be used for a lot of things like that. Like I said, it's a well-liked and well-used stone by me. And typically this is where I'd finish with an edge. It is more than enough for kitchen knives, and in some cases probably too much for most kitchen knives. But it has a very smooth feel. Very positive feedback. And like its 1K counterpart, it's very good with a lot of metals. It's not something that's going to slow down and not work on you when you're trying to sharpen up a harder metal, or even some powder steels. I'm going to go ahead and rinse away all the slurry and mud that's on the stone. And we're going to use it with just water on the surface. Using it like this will help to polish it, and that's our goal for this blade today. We're going to eventually work into a polishing stone and finish off that way. Edge at this point is just extremely sharp. Something I've come to notice with white steel is it just takes an incredible edge. Once again, we're going back to lighter pressure, some longer strokes, make sure things are nice and even. up to the edge trailing strokes here. Finish it off. Make sure the edge is nice and clean. Though this is rated at a 6K level, it it can produce a little bit higher of a grit pattern and a finish on the edge. Most will call it a 8K sometimes, but in my opinion it's just a really good 6K stone. Burr on the back side, and that feels like that removed it right there. Check. Yep, that's gone there. Feels pretty good on that side. We'll go ahead and grab our handy dandy piece of yellow legal pad here. As you can see, glides right through the paper effortlessly. Ooh. Seems like we might have a little bit of burr up at the tip there. We'll work down with our further use of stones here. Go ahead and move on to the 10K polishing stone I have. I'm not real sure how to say the name of this stone, but I think it's called the Imache 10K. It's a rather inexpensive 10K polishing stone. It will definitely out-polish. Well, it'll take to a very high polish. It's kind of hard to explain. The metal builds up on the surface like it did with some other stones. That's its main working characteristic. As it does so, in my opinion, it compresses the abrasive down, making it a little finer, and the metal built up on the surface helps to burnish the edge. And by that you get a very high luster into the edge. 10K is what it's rated, but if you work it like I'm going to today, you can easily reach a 15 or 20,000 grit finish on your edge, which is very sharp, and with minimal strafing you could take this edge and give yourself a nice close shave. The stone is very smooth, typically easily gouged, so you want to be a little bit careful with that. Like I mentioned, it's a relatively inexpensive stone, and it works really quick. You want to make sure your edge is nice and refined before you go into this stone, otherwise it's going to polish up too quickly for the scratch pattern you have on the edge. So you want to be really close to the high grit level that it's at prior to using it. The stone feel itself is very smooth and silky, so that's very nice. But you don't. It's mainly for double bevels like this. You don't want to use it on large single bevels. It's just not the type of stone. It doesn't produce any mud, and with all the swarf and metal buildup, using it on a large single bevel can cause minor scratching problems that can ruin the aesthetics of working on a large bevel like that. So we're going to go ahead and get started with this stone here, finish up this blade. can see, it's already got a lot of metal and swarf removed onto the surface. When it comes to working with higher grit stones like this, I like to keep the surface flushed well. I don't like a lot of that metal swarf to build up, simply because I tend to feel it on the stone, and any little particles that are larger than the grit we're working with can affect the edge. So I like to keep the stone well flushed, but it's good to remember not to touch the surface of the stone, because once again, what you have done right here is reducing the scratch pattern, and if you affect this in any way, it will change what's being done to the edge of your knife. Pretty close to being done with the working of this stone. Ow. Kind of scalped my knuckle right there. Like I said, this knife is extremely sharp. Any little touch to it just instantly bites into the skin. And the edge is extremely high polished, very mirror-like in polish. Go ahead and give it a rinse into the water and move on to the edge trailing strokes to finish up with this one. I'm going to do quite a few passes like this just because the grit is very fine. I want to make sure that the edge is as pure as possible. The more you work to make your edge burr free, the better your edge will be. The easier it will be to strough, and the longer the edge will last, because it will have less deformities that will affect its performance. I notice a lot of people using a deburring block when they sharpen, especially between grits. I'm kind of baffled by this. Why you would deburr between grits is kind of beyond me. When you create an edge, you're grinding each side, and as you get to the apex, whatever metal you're dragging down to the edge or pushing to one side creates that burr at the edge. And as you reduce your pressure, like I'm showing here, that was a spine. As you reduce the pressure that you're applying, that formation of the burr reduces, so that you're just grinding the edge to the apex, and whatever debris and burr that is formed at the apex of the edge is polished off in a way. move on to another stone, you're starting the process over again. You're grinding at the peaks of the scratches that you've produced until you get down to the valleys of the scratches that were there previously. As you do this, you will recreate a burr for the next finer grit stone. You're removing the scratch pattern from, say, 1,000 stone and producing a scratch pattern from a 4,000 grit stone, which is also producing a 4,000 grit burr. And you do this all the way to the very end. This is just a process that repeats itself. In this case, I'm producing a 10,000 grit scratch on a 6,000 grit edge, removing a 6,000 grit scratch and a 6,000 grit burr, and producing it and replacing it with a 10,000 grit scratch and a 10,000 grit level burr. So the burr between grits, like I said, kind of baffles me a little bit because it's scientifically pointless in a way. It's just basically saying that you're not doing enough stone work before moving on to your next stone. The little steps that I'm showing here in this video of edge trailing and refining your edge before you move on to the next stone is your deburring step. That is what you want to do. You want to do it on the stone before you move to another stone. If you take a block of anything and you drag your edge through it, you're impacting the edge, you're causing deformations and stresses into the edge, which is damaging the work that you're producing. So that's not something I would ever recommend, simply. I'm going to make one more light pass. Edge felt really good right there. Not sure if you see this in the video at all. Bevel's probably just too small to see, but it's very mirror polished and very, very sharp. Once again, we'll grab our yellow paper here and show you that it just slices through it effortlessly. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hope the stone demonstrations were enough to give you an idea of how they work. If you have any questions or comments about it, please leave it in the section below.